Reading with your kids.
Hey, so great to see you. Come on in. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We are coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. Please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Podchaser, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Google Podcasts, Himalaya, wherever you find your podcast. Our guest today is Katherine Factor. She is the author of the latest Choose Your Own Adventure. It's called Spies, Harry Houdini. I'm really excited to talk to Katherine about one of my heroes in magic, Harry Houdini. If you haven't heard yet, I've only mentioned it a couple of thousand times here on the podcast. I do educational magic shows all around the country. I've been doing it for 30 years. My most popular show is called We Will Roar, Respect Others and Read. Now, because of the current pandemic and the uncertainty and what's going to happen in the upcoming school year, I've decided to take my show and put it on Zoom. That's right, I can come to your classroom anywhere in the world. And I'm really actually quite excited about it. I've been presenting a number of shows on Zoom, and I love the fact that I am able to get kids involved in the show. They're able to be interactive. They're able to be a great part of the show. And because they're on my screen, I can see these amazing reactions. It really is wonderful. And of course, the message of the show that we should always be respectful of everybody in our lives, and we should also read, and read vividly, and read often, every single day. It really resonates with the kids. I would love for you to check it out. Even if you are not the principal of your school or the enrichment officer, schools, they're struggling right now. This is a new situation. No one knows what's going on. And if you would bring to their attention that, hey, there's this internationally acclaimed school show that's available on Zoom. It's a great way to end the school year. It's a great program for summer camp, especially if summer camps can't happen when the school year comes back in the fall. Even if kids are attending school in person, it's going to be a long time before they are able to be enrichment programs live in school. So check it out today. Go to my website, please, wewillroar.com. Joining us right now, I'm so excited talk about a subject that's close to my heart. Today we're talking about Choose Your Own Adventure, Spies, Harry Houdini. Please welcome to the show the author, Katherine Factor. Katherine, welcome. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. This is so exciting, and I'm happy to share Harry Houdini with your podcast audience.
Well, you're going to share it with me, too, because, you know, as someone who's been presenting educational magic shows for over 30 years, Harry Houdini is right there. When I go to schools, kids will come up to me and they go, hey, have you ever heard of Houdini? And I'm like, yes, I have. But what have you heard about Houdini? And the wild thing is that there's probably, for somebody who's lived not all that long ago, there's a whole lot of myths and mysteries around this king of mysteries.
That's true. And these books are able to explore many of those mysteries, including, essentially there's even some theories about like how he died. Mm-hmm. I mean, most people believe, if they don't know much about his life, that of course he must have died doing one of his tricks. But that's not the case. So in these books that have multiple endings, I was able to sort of explore, his end, both by doing some of the magic tricks that were extremely grueling on the body and death-defying, and also, how he did pass, which was really just an infection in his stomach. Mm-hmm. So
not quite as glamorous.
No, but still really fun to think about.
Well, you just said that your book has multiple endings, and, somebody listening might be scratching their head and go, wait a minute. But the fact of the matter is, Choose Your Own Adventure it's a series of books that are like my magic show, they're totally interactive. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. These are a series that began in the very, very early 80s. It's something that I grew up with reading, and the time that I fell in love with reading was like very much connected to being able to pick up a choose your own adventure book and play the book. So in other words, I mean that these are interactive game novels in the sense that you're reading stories, but you as the reader are being addressed and you are the main character. You become the protagonist, and then you have to make choices as you read. So every few pages there's a new choice, like choose if you want to, join the freak show to learn spy skills, you turn to a certain page, or if you decide to continue your performing life as Houdini but seek out counterfeiters, then you would turn to another page. And so these are branching narratives. The stories kind of keep going and keep going. And if you sort of feel like you can't come to an ending that you didn't like, you can just flip backward or start over again and then make a different set of choices. So it's actually a neat opportunity to sort of think about choices that we make and starting over and failing forward.
Yeah, but that's really, really cool. And, here at the Reading with Your Kids podcast, we're all about encouraging families to read together. And this just sounds like a book. It's designed for middle grade kids. So it sounds like this is just perfect for that. Where we want to encourage our kids to read independently and develop that love of reading, but at the same time still be involved with them and talk about the books that they're reading together. So this would be really cool for a family to pick up 4 copies and they're reading it and everybody's making different choices and then coming together to kind of let folks know what their adventure they're on.
Yes, absolutely. And as someone who has read across the country and now is doing online workshops, I have found that younger kids can, be read to. One can paraphrase, a parent can paraphrase some of the, or summarize some of what's on the page, and just that there's this general excitement about being involved in the reading, which I think is so important, especially at a younger age, to not feel shut out of a reading experience. And also these books can sort of, become a family joke, or a family way of making decisions too, and thinking about how these decisions affect our daily routine, or what if I had gone, down the other way in the hallway or something. And just sort of in general, it's really fun for making up stories together. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of ways to turn these into a project at home or a summer writing project. And as an educator, I've found that really wonderful to see what all ages come up with. In our Spies series, and my 2 books are based on historical figures, so it's also sometimes can skew as it's dealing with U.S. and European history of 100 years ago. And so sometimes we even get 13 and older to read too, because why not? Everyone gets to play the hero or shero in the story.
You were talking about having fun, making choices within the family. One of the things that I've said since we started publishing the Reading with Your Kids podcast is that, those conversations that you need to have with your kids when they're older about making healthy choices, those conversations really start when they're young and you're asking your kid, what do you want to read? And you're respecting that choice and talking about the consequences of those choices. I mean, this seems perfect for that. Just kind of, you made that choice and look where it led you, and could really lead into some great, really important conversations about the choices kids need to make, and they need to start making them at an earlier and earlier age.
I agree, and I really, really believe in creative reading. And by that I mean that when we find something that we like to read, we can encourage that and acknowledge that in each other. And rather than, be like, have expectations about what a child should be reading or what they should be enjoying. So when I have students, I like to tell them that if they don't find themselves enjoying what they're reading, or their eyeballs are like not sticking to the page, that is not a comment on their intelligence, but rather just continue to try to find something where you feel involved, and not necessarily, entirely like a choose your own adventure, but something where I just say your eyeballs are sticking to the page, right? Like there's something that's about the language or the story or the way that it is unfolding that the student will enjoy. So I have a like fairly traditional educational background, and I, as a literary person, right, like I think there's so much that we are expected to read and know about, but I'm really a big fan of, obviously, of creative writing, but also of creative reading, where it's okay to skim. It's okay to, feel like, okay, I'm not really connecting to this book. And it's okay to stop and start. And one thing, that I love about Choose Your Own Adventure is that you can read one story and maybe you come to an end and maybe you don't pick it up again. But of course, you can always go back and start over. And I like that as well. So it feels like cyclical and it feels more natural to how our brains really operate. Even though I'm a big fan, as Houdini was, of logic and rationality and linear, linear progress, right? A magic trick might seem to be supernatural or full of surprises, but there's like very linear, right? Like in a way, there's like rules to get to that illusion.
Yep, absolutely. I'm curious, were you always a fan of magic and a fan of Houdini?
I think like at that same time, I was about 8 or 9, and falling in love with reading Choose Your Own Adventures. And, at the time, the vintage series of Choose Your Own Adventure, they really take you on different trips in the world. And there were aspects of magic in them. For instance, one of the original, was Journey Under the Sea, and that dealt with Atlantis. There was ones in outer space. There were ones with the Mayan civilization, and like that just very much opened up my imagination. And then I did also at that time read a lot of like Lois Duncan or Lois Lowry. They had protagonist female characters that had like extrasensory perception. So I think I was into the supernatural and maybe not understanding, that magic was more of a science. And Houdini really advocated for that. I remember that time, very much knowing about Houdini and being fascinated by him, and also loving like just, the golden age of Hollywood. And, Houdini, we know a lot about him because he was a master promoter of himself and of the magic arts, but not of the supernatural. And he also, made films. So there's a lot of, we have footage both of him doing the tricks, and we also have the black and white silent films that he was in. So I do believe that I wouldn't say that maybe like Houdini and I would have gotten along in terms of like our interests in things that come from the invisible. But he certainly was a part of my young imagination. And so it was fun to revisit him and really get to know him.
Yeah, one of the things that Houdini is known for, I think mainly in amongst magicians, but some folks in the general public, he was not a fan of psychics and mediums, and he spent a lot of time debunking a lot of those folks.
He actually had his own spies that he sent out to seances, and he himself would go in disguise and then break up these seances, which were very, very popular at the time. And they had been for quite a while. But one thing I learned recently that is like pertinent is that he probably did have, it seems like that he did have the Spanish flu, but because he was a middle age, he was sort of he had the right body and immune system that it didn't affect him. But because so many people had to pass between the Spanish flu and the war, there was a huge surge in spiritual mediums, because people wanted to try to connect with their dead loved ones. And so at that point, towards the end of his life and career, I mean, he got very vehement about fraudsters. He didn't want people losing money to try to attempt to contact the other side. When he didn't I think a lot of his life he was conflicted about it, but for the most part, he didn't think it was possible. He came to understand that it wouldn't be possible, and so people shouldn't pay money for that, even though they needed to have hope. And in fact, you probably know this, after he promised his wife that if he were to pass on to the other side, that he would attempt to contact her through a seance. Yep. And so she and others for more than 10 years they would gather on Halloween and have a seance to see if Houdini would talk. Because he passed on Halloween, strangely enough. And then it didn't happen. Right.
Yes.
So parts of the book explore all that too. But the book begins in 1899, where you are, a younger Houdini that really is trying to still build your career.
Fascinating. There are many, many rumors that Houdini was, in fact, a spy. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yes. And I think I should probably give a shout out to these two writers that put forth the spy theory, I think over a decade ago, and their book is The Secret Life of Houdini, Kalish and Sloman. And so, that book was extremely important to try to for me to play with this theory. And so the part of the theory is that, when he was, younger, he was such a hard worker. This is really his life, and my story too is a beautiful immigrant story, because the family was from Budapest and was living in Appleton, Wisconsin, and the father was a failed rabbi, and the circus came through, and that sparked his imagination, but also he worked as a locksmith. There were all these little pieces to his development that made it seem yes, he should pursue sleight of hand and cuff tricks and box tricks in order to try to bring money, into the household. And he slaved away on all these circuits that were, both kind of circus, small circuits, and then also places where, magic could take place, and places that were called dime museums at the time. And so the theory is that when he, there were so many magicians, this was such a popular form of entertainment, and he wasn't making it. It wasn't working out. But the theory is that he makes an agreement, these Chicago cops, and one of them is a Secret Service agent, and the Secret Service was pretty new to the country, and they believed that magicians could be effectual spies because they already had the skill set. So the idea is that Houdini struck a deal to go and pursue counterfeiters for the U.S. safety and security, because at the time there was so much money that was being made, that was falsely being made. And so then he becomes a lot more popular. So the theory is that he both wanted to help his country, his adopted country, and also increase his ability to be known.
Yeah, fascinating. And I read that book many, many years ago, the book you're referencing, and it is fascinating. He just had. He's a larger-than-life figure. You were mentioning how he was an amazing promoter, and would just as I understand his performance style. Nowadays everything is bang, 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 and things happen, and you do 15 tricks in 2 or 3 minutes, whereas he would go out and one of his tricks might last a half an hour, 45 minutes, with the build up and all of this, and just incredible. I'm curious, this style of writing, the choose your own adventure, how difficult was it for you to write something like this?
Oh, it's pretty difficult. I mean, it's mind bending. Honestly, it's its own magic trick, and one becomes a little bit cross-eyed at trying to keep track of the different sub-stories. And so there's this is the first one I would say probably was more difficult because I'm learning the genre. But my background training and first love was like poetry, so I really just was able to approach kind of each little scene, and we call them like story branches, as, as like poem vignettes, like thinking about, okay, what does this page need? And these do rely on a lot of action, and dialogue, which is something, that doesn't have to be in poetry, though it can be. And so, in that way I had to make it more prosaic, but thinking about it conceptually was like putting a book of poems together. Sometimes they talk to each other, and sometimes reading a book of poems, it's totally okay to skip around, right? And you don't have to read them in order. And so in that way, I think I had like a brain, that was set up for it. And also, but I'd have to write and then organize, right? Like write and then outline and re-outline and then do different types of outlines and make sure that your page numbers, cause you're jumping around, that they were making sense and connecting.
Yeah. I've often talked to authors who create fantasy worlds, and I would say to them, do you need to keep like an encyclopedia of what the different powers are and all the rules in the universe you're creating? And so that boggles my mind. But this is even more complex, I think, because you have these branches, and the story goes this way and that way, and then it comes back over here, and it connects with that. And have you ever done the math to figure out how many different possible stories there are in your book?
There are, I think 23 endings in Harry Houdini, and around the same, maybe a little bit more in Mata Hari. And so, I think the series has been around for decades, and there are like 180 of these books by Choose Your Own Adventure. So, like, just imagine, all of the endings, all the possibilities, and that, the amount of readers that have had different experiences on one book object, right?
Yeah.
When you start multiplying the amounts of like different journeys and adventures that readers all around the world have had, and that seems like a very, beautiful thing for a book to be able to do. And for readers to be able to do. But I, will admit that sometimes I had an ending in mind. In Mata Hari, like she had a terrible, her life. I mean, she was essentially a victim and was set up, and, it was a very misogynistic, end to her life. And so like, I didn't want to write that ending, that ending wasn't going to be in there. And it was a horrible atrocity, just one of the many atrocities of war in World War I. And so for instance, like sometimes I'd have an ending for her, but maybe I didn't know how it was going to connect to something that was happening in the middle. So then sometimes you're like rewiring the thread after you're writing forwards into the book, and then trying, sort of making a synaptic connection there, right? Like getting it to fire together by like literally having an end and knowing the beginning, and maybe having parts of the middle and then connecting them, like making, sort of probably how it would feel to make, electricity happen, or, need to make all your.
I mean, I'm just confused just listening to you. I mean, it's it's really complex. And One of the things I was thinking about, we hear from different experts that, if you have 20 books, if your child has 20 books at their fingertips in your home, then that greatly increases their chances of going to university. Well, you pick up your book, there's 23 different possible stories. That's, it has to help your child's chances of developing a love of reading and getting into university. Are you hooked on this style of writing, or are you tapping out and saying, "Now this is too hard for me"?
I think that the style of writing that way is getting easier. So, and it's something that I know, I feel like confident and excited about. And I'm, poets learn. Poetry today is so many things. And one of the things it can do, it lives everywhere. It's viral. It lives in songs. It lives on Instagram. It's on billboards. There's poetic devices everywhere and ways to use, the romantic poets called it poetic perception. So I have found that that children's literature and, middle grade and YA, is full of poetic perception. And that's something that really interests me. And just thinking about other, especially about ways of, reinventing a biography also and making it accessible to younger ages, because I hope that then that sparks a further love of humanity, and of, maybe researching and having those writer qualities develop in a child where they're you pursue your interests. You learn about a person and their contributions, and then you play with it. And that seems to be pretty freeing to, as a writer.
That's awesome. I'm really excited for you, and I'm really excited for folks to go out and check out Choose Your Own Adventure, Spies, Harry Houdini. If folks want to learn more about your Houdini book or your Mata Hari book, or just about this series, where can they go online?
They can go online to see, so many wonderful Choose Your Own Adventure books at cyoa.com. And in there, there's new board books that have been released by the publisher. There's book boxes. So there's a creatures book box that has the Abominable Snowman and some of the classics in there. And there will be a Spies book box coming out in the fall, and that will have the Spy series in them. And then they also have done a YA series and just lots of wonderful, there's educator materials on there. There's curriculum guides that go with the Spy books so far, and probably others. And then there's more about my work at katherinefactor.com.
Awesome. Well, we've had a great time tonight speaking to the author of Choose Your Own Adventure, Spies, Harry Houdini. The author is Katherine Factor. Katherine, thanks so much for spending time with us tonight.
Thanks to you, Jed, and thanks to all the listeners. This has been really wonderful.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be Amy Elliott. She is the author of the Dreamscape series. That's the next episode of the podcast. I would like to thank the folks who made today's show so very, very wonderful. Of course, we want to thank our guest, Katherine Factor. Please be sure to check out the latest Choose Your Own Adventure, Spies, Harry Houdini. I also want to thank my incredible team, starting with my amazing producer, Fatima Khan, my awesome author ambassador, Peggy Cotto. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. I want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Thank you so much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.